Welcome to another session of the PMDG MD11 training from Angle of Attack. We're still in the thick of approach season, and this time around we'll be doing the visual approach. A visual approach is an approach flown under instrument flight rules that allows an aircraft to proceed visually to the runway without the need for radio navigation and aids such as VORs or an instrument landing system or ILS. So obviously this is dependent on weather minimums and visual reference with terrain and with other features. We will be flying one of the more universally known visual approaches out there in the world, and this is the Parkway visual into New York's John F. Kennedy Airport, often referred to as the Canarsie approach. As with any approach, we must be intimately familiar with the chart and all that is expected of us throughout the procedure. So this particularly is important in this case as we will be hand flying from the get-go. The Parkway visual is for runways 13 left and right only. On this particular approach, we will be using runway 13 left. So we'll jump in at this point under autopilot, tracking the 043 degree radial inbound to the Canarsie VOR. We will disconnect the autopilot almost immediately and hand fly the whole approach as we talked about before. We will also be disabling the auto throttle system. Now this will be a big challenge, but we'll get to that later and you'll see exactly why. So let's go over the narrative that the chart gives us. When cleared for Parkway visual to runway 13 left, right, maintain minimum 2,000 feet until a beam Rockaway Point. Remain west of Rockaway Point, thence east of Kingsborough Community College. Remain east of the Shore Parkway. Cross Brooklyn Coast Guard Air Station, minimum 1,500 feet. Remain east of the Shore Parkway until Canarsie Pier. Now, that's all kind of confusing, but we'll keep looking at it here. That covers the two altitude restrictions on this approach. Both are minimum altitudes, 2,000 feet minimum until Rockaway Point, and minimum 1,500 feet thereon until passing the Coast Guard Air Station. We will actually remain above 1,500 feet until passing overhead the Canarsie VOR, so we will be at 1,500 feet for longer. We'll be tracking the 043 radial inbound to Canarsie VOR, and from there on, we will be making use of the lead-in light clusters in operation along the approach path. And these are strobe lights positioned at these points that will guide us in. And this whole part is also known as the White Rabbit, following the White Rabbit into the runway. Now, these are very useful visual aids, and the approach would be much more difficult without them, so we will be using them as our primary lateral reference in the latter stages of the approach. There will be no vertical guidance apart from the altitude restrictions that we will need to adhere to, and a VASI system, or Visual Approach Slope Indicator system, on runway 13 left that we will reference on the final approach. So the turn of the final is actually going to be a tough one. The wind will be calm, which will simplify things from that perspective, but it is still a demanding and fairly steep turn onto centerline very late in the approach. This is something that you're going to get used to as we go through our approaches here. And we can expect to be turning final at 300 to 500 feet above the ground. And we'll be using Track IR, which is a flight sim hardware add-on for this approach, for the better viewing angles it gives us, especially during that final turn. So let's go through the facts on this approach. Frequencies. We are joining this approach later than the previous two, so we would have already configured the navigation radio page with the frequency and course for a Canarsie VOR 112.3, and all other frequencies are located across the top of the chart as you are used to. Altitudes. As covered, altitude restrictions are present on the approach at Rockaway Point and the Coast Guard Air Station. We will aim to cross the Canarsie VOR at minimum 1,500 feet. Touchdown zone elevation is 13 feet. There is no MDA as this is a visual approach. Highest MSA is 2,800 feet to the northwest of the Canarsie VOR. Course. This doesn't really apply as this is a visual approach. The only course we will be using is the 04 degree bearing inbound to the Canarsie VOR as we talked about before. Terrain. There is nothing of note on the terrain front as this is a very low-lying area, but there are numerous masts scattered around, so we should be clear of all of these. Just keep note that you've got to stay at those minimum altitudes as we talked about before for Rockaway Point and the Coast Guard Air Station, and you should be okay on terrain. Safety. The principal safety concern here is that we will be hand flying the aircraft and controlling the thrust manually. It is therefore imperative that you get as familiar as you can with the handling characteristics of the MD11. We will be flying without the flight director as well, so with the exception of the lead-in strobes along the latter stages of the approach, which you will see, it is all up to you to keep the aircraft happy. That means you have to be on the throttle, you have to be on the yoke, you have to be ready to react to what the aircraft is telling you to do. And this may be a challenge for some of you that are used to using the autopilot so much. So be ready, and I think you'll have a lot of fun with it once you start to get a hang of it. Now let me note also that we will be joining the approach with the airbag checklist completed. So all tasks, including the approach descent checklist, have been completed. All that we have left to do is the before landing checklist. So let's jump in the cockpit and get going. It's a clear night and autoflight is engaged, holding us at 2,500 feet and 210 knots and flaps 15. A peek out the front shows Rockaway Point just up ahead, right where it should be. We are established on the 043 inbound to the Canarsie VOR. So disconnect the autopilot and take the auto throttle out as well. This is done by using the thumb button on the thrust levers or some keyboard shortcuts. ATS off will show on the flight mode annunciator. We will still enter target speeds in the FCP speed window as this sets the speed bug on the PFD for easy reference. So set 180 knots, drop the gear, and don't forget the thrust levers are in your hands. There is no auto throttle to help you out here. So reduce thrust to decelerate and begin a gentle descent. Keep thrust and pitch changes smooth, as the speed and rate of descent can get away from you very fast. We will slow all the way to approach speed, which is 156 knots, so set this on the FCP and continue decelerating through 180 knots and set flaps 35. Bear in mind that all that extra drag will slow you down pretty quickly, so watch that speed and sync rate very carefully. Since we are flying without autopilot and on a visual approach, you have no need to read the actual flight director, so turn it off by pressing the flight director off button on the auxiliary panel if you haven't already done so. Now don't forget we are aiming for 1,500 feet at the Canarsie VOR, so adjust descent rate accordingly. And the MD11 has a very easily readable vertical speed indicator located on the right hand side of the PFD. We haven't quite reached this station yet, so we'll reduce our descent rate to level out at 1,500 feet, so keep your control inputs very gentle at this point and add power if needed. At this point, we're just leveling off at 1,500 feet and aiming for approach speed. As you level off, you'll need to compensate with additional thrusts, and when the cyan RMI needle on the ND flips, as you've just seen, from pointing ahead to pointing behind us, we have passed the station. So we're good to continue our descent now, and the first set of strobes is visible straight ahead of us. That is our aiming point. We'll be aiming to pass over that first set of strobes at 1,000 feet. Let's very briefly go through the before landing checklist. So gear down, 4 green, spoilers armed, auto brakes set medium, flaps 35 checked, EAD and altimeters checked. Green box on the EAD is there, and that indicates that we have an all green for the landing configuration. Before landing checklist complete. Now 1,000 feet isn't a hard altitude restriction over these lights, but it's a good target. So passing overhead the first set of strobes, we'll start a long gentle turn to the right following the rest of the lead-in lights or the white rabbit. So we're just slowing our descent rate a little here to be at 1,000 feet overhead lights. I'd say we've done pretty well there. As you pass overhead, begin a gentle turn to the next light cluster, all the while keeping your speed on target. The key to keeping your speed stable is to use gradual, subtle power changes, so consider how closely linked power, pitch, and rate of descent are. If you suddenly reduce thrust and don't compensate by pitching up, your descent rate will increase a lot, especially in the landing configuration. That pillar between the windshills can be right in the way of your vision throughout this entire approach, so this track IR really helps to overcome that. So in the pass overhead, the second set of strobes pretty much aligned with them. The parkway or road is a great reference here. This long turn is particularly difficult as you need to keep a lot of attention outside, but you must also keep your speed and sink rate on target. Aim for the next set of strobes, which in the real world are on top of a hotel. 1-3 left is equipped with a VASI system. Red over white, you're alright, so we're bang on glide slope here by the look of it. By this point, the aircraft should almost be an extension of your body, as cheesy as that sounds, so keep on those thrust levers like a hawk, keep your speed as close to V approach as you can, and we're spot on here. As you line up with the runway, keep that descent rate in check and don't let it get away from you. Your heartbeat should be pretty high by now, so keep that approach speed stable and fight the instinct to pull up as you close with the ground. At 50 feet, bring thrust to idle and flare at 30 to 40 feet. Settle the wheels down smoothly but without too much float and verify spoiler deployment. Bring in reverse thrust. Engine number 2 will not go into reverse thrust until the nose gear is compressed to avoid excessive pitch moments, so verify deceleration and keep her on center line. Select idle reverse at 80 knots, then stow the thrust reversers once you get down a little bit more into the 60 knot range. Reverse thrust is less effective at low speed, so it's better to save our engine wear for later. Brakes are less costly to replace. Take over with manual braking as you approach the turnoff. Breathe well, a deserved sigh of relief. There's a reason why the Canarsie approach is so renowned. It's a very tough one. The MD11 is a real challenge to hand fly, but really is a pleasure thanks to PMDG's effort on the flight dynamics. The auto throttle system is designed to be used all the way to touchdown under normal circumstances, but it's no sin to make a habit of taking over control yourself from time to time to keep your proficiency up. It really is a balancing act to keep the aircraft happy in pitch, power, and rate of descent all at the same time. At landing weight, even a little excess thrust will throw your speed way over where you want it, but the drag of the landing gear plus 35 degrees of flaps will really pull you down if you don't have enough, so there's that sweet spot. Add in a unique and very challenging visual approach like this one, and you've got a serious task on your hands. Part of me wants to pat you on the back and welcome you to New York, while another is sitting in the background grinning at the prospect of Kai-Tak. Either way, any pilot deserves a pat on the back after a smooth landing on 1-3 left, so good on you. Throttle on.